Hi, I'm Carys and
And I'm Gary Young.
Each week, Gary and I will be talking about the stories in the news that are overreported and the ones that are going completely under the radar and not being talked about enough. This week, we've got a slightly special episode delving into white history.
This is Over the Top, Under the Radar.
Gary, how are you?
I'm good. I went to the premiere of Steve McQueen's new film Blitz last night, which was...
Fancy.
I am very sad. There was a red carpet and everything. I turned up very sweaty and late and not particularly glamorous in my...
Did you get papped?
Beige cords. I did not get papped. No, I did not get papped. But it was awesome. It's about the Blitz. It's about the Second World War. The key protagonist is a black boy in London, and then his mum is white. His black dad had been deported to Grenada. It's a powerful story, I think, or it's a powerful film. Because the Second World War has reached kind of, I think Paul Gilroy once called it kind of ethnic folklore in this country, and the Blitz is so kind of central to have so many non-white characters in it, and to show Britain as a country united against Nazis, but divided within itself, class, gender, race, a range of ways. Anyway, it's a very good film.
Do you know when it's out for us normalos?
I think it's going to be in November.
Ooh, okay, exciting. In a less glamorous mode, been following all of the news, the political news.
Has there been any news?
Well, my favourite bit of news came on Sunday, and this isn't about taking joy in someone losing their job. So obviously there's been a lot of turmoil with the Prime Minister over Freebiegate, and generally, I mean, I believe Keir Starmer's approval ratings are now sub-Farage, which is quite some going in 100 days after having won a landslide. But on Sunday, Sue Gray, his chief of staff, who was the civil servant that investigated Partygate, announced, I mean, I don't think she's no longer chief of staff. She's got some sort of weird job in the regions. So I think she's still on the payroll. But basically, she got knifed by Morgan McSweeney, Keir Starmer's new chief of staff and old campaign manager. The thing I enjoyed was that on Sunday, the news broke that she was losing her job. And then in this just beautiful symbiotic relationship between lobby journalists and political insiders, over the next few days, we learned that a lot of the things that had gone wrong were just entirely Sue Gray's fault. It turns out, Gary, conveniently, she was running the communications grid. Which seems strange, given she's not a comms person. She also, according to one source, anonymous source, introduced Keir to Lord Ali, the person that was giving all the free glasses. I mean, that doesn't hold water, given she's a civil servant. He's a Labour donor and peer who's been kicking her out for years. But I just really enjoyed this, let's fire or demote this one person and then just make them carry the can for everything. It's like, no, it was all her.
Yeah.
I think she shot JFK personally.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it is first of all, I find it really intriguing how the people who can be socially conservative, and in this particular regard, I regard Starmer as socially conservative, in terms of talk about personal responsibility, don't take responsibility for anything. So he becomes leader of the Labour Party, blames Corbyn for everything. When he loses in Hartlepool or Blackpool, one of the pools, where Corbyn had won even in 2019, he still blames Corbyn. When Labour's doing better, of course, then he takes all the credit himself, then he gets into government, and then everything that they do is the fault of the Tories. And now everything that he's done since he's been in government is the fault of Sue Gray. It's like, dude, take some responsibility for what you do. Even if she did introduce him to Lord Ali, she didn't say, I'm going to introduce you to Lord Ali, you might get a decent pair of specs and a nice suit out of him. I mean, he's still got some kind of agency there, right?
Yeah, but it's a nonsense. She was the ethics lead in the civil service, and he has been giving to the Labour Party for years and is no doubt, he stopped giving under Corbyn. It's just what? I think it's also the thing that, I mean, it's fair on the responsibility point. I think for me, it's just more a bit in those moments, I find it so boring reading most of the lobby or most political journalists, because they just sort of repeat without in any way interrogating whatever someone's whispered or WhatsApp to them. And it's just a bit ugh. I mean, we wish Sue well with her new job in the regions. I'm sure she will continue to get paid. But yeah, I find it's a bit quite disappointing, all of it, how quickly the wheels have sort of come off or ground to a halt.
We got a lovely tweet this week from Lucy Nabiju. I hope I pronounced it right, Lucy. Thanks, Carys and Gary, for pointing up the silence over how implicated we all are in the Gaza, Israel, Lebanon conflict. As you say, it's not something happening over there because of some dodgy ethnics. We're up to our necks in it.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And also you have an absolutely adorable profile picture. I don't know whose cat that is, but they look very cute.
You can message us on socials at over_under_pod_ or send us an email at info@overunderpod.com.
Huge thank you and a big shout out to all the people who support us on Patreon or who've signed up to support us on Patreon. We have 279 incredibly generous paying members who support the podcast and help to keep it running. And if you're listening and you're able to support us, please subscribe to our Patreon today. This week, we have some brand new signups who've joined the Over the Top Under the Radar gang. Jim, Ailey, Matthew, Jay, Amandeep, Louisa, Matthew, two Matthews, Phil, Laura, Hannah and Mick. Thank you so much to each and every one of you. We really appreciate your support. Gary, we're doing something slightly different this week. Do you want to explain what we're up to, given that was your idea?
Yeah, well, it kind of somewhat comes out of the conversation that we had last week where we were talking about Black History Month. That was my kind of over, and I was talking about why I'm ambivalent about it, although I support it. This is partly born from the kind of irritation, certainly I have, with the way that Black History Month forces us to do two things. First of all, to tell not just our story, but the story of colonialism and slavery and discrimination and all of that stuff, that we actually have to inform, as well as informing ourselves, we have to do the work of kind of excavating white history as well in order to tell our stories. And the second is that Black History Month is always told, or generally told, in a passive voice. Rosa Parks was kicked off a bus, or people were enslaved, but somebody did those things. And when I think, say, of Rosa Parks, we don't hear about Mr. Blake, the bus driver who kicked her off the bus. And I would like to know more about Mr. Blake and how, I know he's dead now, but how he understood what he did, whether history has changed him or whatever. But we always, when it's Black History Month, we generally don't go that extra mile. So this is really, I mean, White History Month as a notion is really an attempt to do for white history what we try to do for Black history, which is excavate things we don't know, celebrate people that we don't know, interrogate things that we don't know, and produce a more honest and complete history than the one that we have.
So the idea isn't to replace Black History Month, but just to see what we can learn by taking a slightly different angle in on our history. And I think understanding that, and a lot of people do understand this, that history in itself is political. Like there's that sort of Fidel Castro quote when he's on trial where he says, history will absolve us. And like, if you're writing the history book, you can just absolve yourself from slavery, from colonialism. And I think that sense of like the history that we tell, the things we choose to lift up and shine light on is political. And this sense that it's kind of like posh white guys that drive history. And I'm just not convinced that that's true. And also it's not serving us.
Look, we can tell history differently. We can tell it better. It can be better informed. It can be more complete. We don't have to be so both unimaginative and wrongly loaded, I guess, with these kind of peculiar emphases and places where we get stuck. Like countries have myths, I get that, but we can get so stuck on these individual things. And then we don't even tell them right.
So my under the radar for this, our inaugural White History Month, is the Slave Compensation Act of 1837. It was going to be a person, but then I made it a piece of legislation, Gary. So for those of you who don't know, as part of the abolition of slavery, there was the Slavery Abolition Act, but there was also the Slave Compensation Act in 1837, which kind of did what it said in the tin. It compensated the people who owned slaves for the money they were going to lose by not being allowed to do slavery anymore. It allocated £20 million, which was 40% of the Treasury's tax bill at the time. So a pretty big chunk of money. In today's money, David Olusoga estimates it's about £16 billion to anyone who came forward and owned slaves. I think it's like quite mind-boggling that people who had made money from exploiting people for free labor were then paid again. But the other reason it came up for me as like an important part of White History Month is we only finished paying off the final slave-owning families' descendants in 2015, which is because some of them chose to get an annuity. So for those of you who aren't deep into pensions, some of them were like, I'd just like a regular payment rather than a lump sum. Sidebar, really fascinated by the civil service team that came up with how to compensate slave owners. I think the Act is an important, oft forgotten part of white history. And the other thing I wanted to mention was one which I think, again, sums up the strange way that we understand abolition and what the slave trade was in our history, which was that in 2018, the Treasury's official Twitter feed tweeted out a Friday fun fact, which I'm just going to read it because it's honestly amazing. Here's today's surprising Friday fact. Millions of you helped to end the slave trade through your taxes. And then we've got a graphic with a bunch of enslaved people. And it says, did you know in 1833, Britain used £20 million, 40% of its national budget, to buy freedom for all slaves in the empire. The amount of money borrowed for the Slavery Abolition Act was so large, it wasn't paid off until 2015, which means that living British citizens helped pay to end the slave trade. And I'm a communications professional by trade. If people want to understand the power of communications and storytelling or how it can go really wrong, just take a look at the brilliant narrative and logic behind this, rather than saying for centuries we've been paying a bunch of people who did something abominable money to compensate them for the fact they had to stop. And that the descendants of slaves, tax money has potentially been going to these descendants of these morally bankrupt, rich white people. The Treasury was like, actually, good news, you helped to abolish slavery, which is just such a nonsense from beginning to end. And I think does sort of, for me, sum up why, if we don't think about whiteness, the history of whiteness and how it's evolved, we end up in some very strange places. I imagine the tweet was deleted. I had to find a screenshot of it.
Yeah. I mean, I remember that tweet and kind of thinking, oh, God, like, thank you for reminding me that Black people are paying twice for their servitude. But it also reminded me of, there was this notion, well, slavery is a long time ago. Even colonialism, people think, was a long time ago, of the number of kind of unfinished businesses like that where you're still paying for slavery, or Haiti still paying for its freedom, like for the outrage of demanding its freedom and having its slave rebellion, or Patrice Lumumba's tooth that the Belgian government only recently, in the last 10 years or so, less than that, returned to his family. They kept his bloody tooth. Or the Germans returning some of the bones of the Herero who they murdered during the genocide in the early 20th century. That the degree to which these things are still in different ways, obviously not as dramatically as when they were actually going on, are still playing out. But it would have taken somebody sufficiently clueless to issue that tweet. It shows the Home Office with their lessons learned review. They said one of the problems here was that the people in the Home Office didn't know their own history. And so they didn't know how to navigate this stuff. So the extent to which it's consequential. So that tweet said so much. I remember when I saw it, just thinking, what kind of understanding of what that tweet means would there have to be for a person to send that tweet?
Yeah, well, I think for me, it just, I don't think we should ever forget that part of the abolition of slavery was paying slave owners. It just feels like a pretty key piece of history, and also just to understand like what really matters and has really mattered in British society for so long, which is just property and ownership. But I also think that the twisted treasury tweet is also a bit of a sign of the way that we really, as British people, have managed to do this trick with slavery where the story is about the fact we abolished it rather than the fact that we started it, and that even, you know, you hear often, wow, slavery has always existed. There is no comparison for the like systematic structural way in which one set of people were dehumanized, turned into a commodity, and then shipped in like unprecedented numbers around the world to do backbreaking physical labor to enrich a country. The way that slavery functioned in the Roman Empire or like previous civilizations, like there is no comparison. And somehow, as British people, we've managed to turn that into a story about how wonderful and moral we were because we got rid of it. And it's like, but who invented it? Like, why did it exist in the first place? And also, part of getting rid of it was that you agreed to pay the people who'd already massively enriched themselves money for the suffering they would incur by not being able to exploit people anymore. You know, David Cameron, who, sidebar, has a couple of relatives who received money as a result of the Slave Compensation Act, and successive and prior British prime ministers have refused to issue an apology or enter a meaningful conversation about reparations. So the people that were enslaved, their like descendants, get nothing, barely an apology, certainly not a penny of compensation. But the rich, awful people and their descendants get money, which, yeah, I think is, I don't love thinking and talking about slavery, but I think it's quite a key window into understanding how the world works now and how racism functions now.
It's the idea of who gets compensated and who doesn't, and the resistance that people have to things like reparations, where they say, oh, well, I'm not responsible for what my forebears did. And it's like, okay, well, then give us all that stuff back then, because your forebears stole that stuff. So if you were going to cut yourself off cold turkey from everything that your forebears did, then you're going to want to dismantle that system of oppression and give back all the stuff you stole. If you're not going to do that, then you are for reparations, but you're just for reparations for yourself.
Well, I think that's the key thing. It's like reparations were paid to the white people, and they were still being paid until 2015. So I think for me, it's more the fact of the act. Probably people know that there was an act of parliament that abolished slavery, but did they know that a few years later they were like, oh, and by the way, the people we said we weren't property, for purposes of this, they kind of are property. And for that reason, we will need to pay 40% of our tax receipts to those families. And some of them want an annuity, so that'll run for another century. The tentacles of all this stuff reach through into now. So yeah, I think it's not my favorite piece of legislation, but I think it's a really important one and a different way into understanding slavery.
I mean, that leads on very well, actually, to my over, which is William Wilberforce. Big name, big dude, William Wilberforce, who led we're gonna talk about this, but certainly in Parliament, led the charge to the abolition of slave trade in 1807. And my first point actually comes on in a way from your last point. That there's a great quote from Eric Williams, who was the first Prime Minister of a free Trinidad and Tobago, and also wrote a landmark study called Capitalism and Slavery, in which he talked about how slavery helped fund or was central to the funding of the Industrial Revolution, which hit the world like a bombshell. Then economic historians tried to discredit it. Now it's come back into fashion again. But Eric Williams wrote, the British historians wrote almost as if Britain had introduced Negro slavery solely for the satisfaction of abolishing it. So that idea that you mentioned of like, we stopped doing it, aren't we awesome? It's like, yeah, but you did it and you didn't give any of the stuff back that you stole, and you compensated the people who did it. So you're going to want to tamp that down. Now, obviously, William Wilberforce was involved in a very good thing. He was involved in the abolition of the slave trade. He was heavily involved, and I am glad that he was. I'm not grateful, because I don't feel that I need to be grateful, but the way in which he towers over the conversation about the slave trade admits at least two things. First of all, he didn't do it by himself. central to Britain's feeling about slavery is one main thing that's missed out is the rebellions of the enslaved people themselves, that when Haiti got its freedom successfully, a successful insurrection and rebellion against its white French overlords, the Brits thought, oh, look at that, here's an opportunity, let's go in and take over this small, weak black country. And they basically got their asses kicked in 1793 and had to give it up. Then in 1831, there was a massive uprising in Jamaica. The slave trade had been abolished, but slavery wasn't abolished until 1833. These things concentrate the mind of British people. So it sounds like Wilberforce did it all by himself. Also, strategically, he wasn't particularly good. He would schedule votes at the wrong time. He didn't get secure majorities in the Lords. He needed a lot of help to get it through. In that sense, in a strategic sense, he wasn't brilliant. In a moral sense, when it came to slavery, he was good. But the final point with Wilberforce is that about almost everything else, he was absolutely awful. He was against working class people getting the vote. He was viscerally anti-abortion. So you got lots of schools named after William Wilberforce. You've also got lots of pro-life organizations named after William Wilberforce, who was basically a deeply conservative man who was opposed to slavery. And so he did a good thing. I'm glad that he did that thing. And there is more to him than is kind of regularly portrayed. And he was a less impressive figure than is regularly portrayed, and he wasn't the only one.
So he was mad chaotic, quite right-wing, but had his heart in the right place on slavery.
Yeah.
Problematic fave. I think it's interesting. I think the thing that really jumped out to me is the like through line between the abolition of slavery and the end of the majority of the British colonial era. And that's the thing is the common thread is this sort of main character energy where like white British people, whether they be the state or the abolitionists, like I saw very recently a tweet of, it's the anniversary of Britain giving India its freedom. And it was like, this sense that like white people are this like benevolent force. Main character energy is a very sort of internet kid way of describing it, but like you are the center of the story, you are the one doing everything. It just sort of ignores the fact that like often in history, like the British state or like the British aristocracy, like if they're a main character, they're kind of the villain, not even that subtly, like they are the baddie. Sounds like Wilberforce wasn't a baddie, but I mean, I'm not into the pro-life stuff.
Yeah. I mean, he wasn't a baddie, but he wasn't quite the greatie that they make out. When I lived in the States, come July the 4th, quite often Americans, including African Americans sometimes, would be like, oh, I guess this is a tough day for you. And it would take a while to work out what they meant. But what they meant was because, America got its freedom from Britain. And I'd say to them, no, my people really didn't have a dog in that fight, to be honest. But also, pretty much most days, certainly every month, but I would say many days of the year, somebody is celebrating getting rid of the Brits. Today is your day. And, congratulations. But please don't understand this as being in some way unique if you're British, knowing that somebody is celebrating getting rid of you, because that is the story of quite a lot of the world. In terms of under the radar, I want to talk about a woman who I think relatively few of our listeners will have known about, a woman called Viola Liuzzo. I think I'm pronouncing her name right, Liuzzo. Viola Liuzzo was born in California in 1925, white woman, working class family that moved about, including going to the South, then going up to Michigan. She married a couple times. She had 5 kids. She had a deep sense of moral responsibility, moral courage, I think. She also had a very close black friend when she lived in Detroit. 1964 is the Civil Rights Act. 1965, King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they're in Alabama, and they're trying to secure the right to vote. If any of you have seen the film Selma, This is the moment where Viola comes in. They organize a march to go from Selma, where the voting rights are being absolutely trashed, to Montgomery, which is the state capital of Alabama. It's a fair distance. So they organize this march. They are beaten up by the state troopers on St. Edmund Peters Bridge. And then they decide that they're going to do it again, and they have more protection. And Viola decides to come down from Detroit after they were beaten up. King says, we need help here. We need people to come down. She comes down. She helps out. She ferries people around. She goes up to the SCLC office and she says, what can I do? So she joins the march. She marches one of the full days. She rejoins the march a little bit later, 4 miles from the end. She's involved in the celebration. She helps at the first aid station. And then after they reach the capital and King calls the march a shining moment in American history, she helps take people back to Selma. So she's shuttling backwards and forwards, helping people take people back to Selma. And while she's doing that, 3 Klansmen in a car, or actually there are 4 people in the car, 3 Klansmen shoot her dead. They chase her and they shoot her dead. It turns out that one of the people in the car is an FBI informant, and then there is a significant amount of cover-up, and he only died in 1998. I think Viola's story, I mean, it's important in itself, you know, it's engaging, but so long as there's been racism, there have been white people, not enough of them by any manner of means, but there have been white people who have been against it. That's important because of this notion that, like, oh, he was a man of his time, or, you know, that was the times. That was before racism was wrong. Well, you know, throughout this time, from the beginning of slavery, from the civil rights movement, anti-apartheid, there were white people who were against it. I think that's important to understand because white history is not racist history. It has a lot of racists in it. You can't understand racism without it. And there are all of these people who, like Viola, who in big ways and small, big sacrifices and small, said, you know what? No. And I'll put my life on the line for this. I'm going to do everything I can. And they don't need to be saints, but they do need to stand up and be counted. And unlike William Wilberforce, who I think is counted and should be counted, but shouldn't be overcounted, there are people, activists, people on the ground, people like Viola, who we don't know about and who we should celebrate more.
Well, she's a good end. I'd never heard of Viola. Love that she was married twice. I consider that to be very chic. I think the thing that's most interesting to me is also that sense of a lot of history is a sort of great man theory of history. And there are these great, normally wealthy and privileged men who shape the world. And actually, the engine of history is often people who aren't insanely wealthy and well-connected or part of a sort of dynasty and just, take part in social movements because they know that something is wrong and at risk to themselves. And I think it is important, as you say, given it's White History Month, we don't want to overcount how amazing white people are in dismantling racism. And a lot of the casualties of the struggle against racism are white people who knew that the system that they were complicit in was wrong. I'm thinking of the young woman who died in Charlottesville when there were far-right Klan protests there a few years ago. And I loved hearing about Viola.
I think that there's a tricky balance here because we don't want to, as you say, like go over the top in terms of our praise for white people doing the right thing. I think it's also important, particularly if we look at the initial premise of this, of White History Month, if we look at Black History Month, one of the things that should be good in Black History Month is trying to make people understand that they are not just the recipients of history. History doesn't just happen to them, they can happen to it. They can make a difference. And so giving, where there are stories like this, William Wilberforce, born to great wealth, goes into parliament. Not everybody's going to have that chance, but here's someone who had a car and a Morale and went down to Selma and did what she could do.
I think there are a couple of other things that stand out to me about her story. I mean, I think one is just that it's very easy when the civil rights movement is reduced to black and white images or stills of young black people being attacked by dogs or by police officers or white people with clubs. I think like there's a lot of iconography around it. But I think the other thing to remember is that the violence that maintained the system was not just directed to black people. And when push came to shove, Viola's whiteness wasn't a protection because she was challenging the system. And I think that often social movements, and especially social movements in black history, get defanged, and you have people like Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King who were incredibly political and radical figures, and I mean Gandhi as well, and a sort of similar vein, although slightly different, become these just like heroes, wonderful, peaceful, Christ-like figures who had a peaceful vision for how the world could be better, and with the strength of their like moral conviction and speechifying were able to end injustice and the brutal reality of like, no, these were awful, oppressive, violent systems that were enforced by arms of the state and that profited huge groups of people, and they were dismantled often with violence and struggle on the streets, and there were casualties. Yeah, I think that gets forgotten in that sort of clean sweep of history, and women like Viola get forgotten. My over the top is Henry VIII. You know, I was thinking about white people and white people that get too much airtime. And for me, Henry takes the cake. Two reasons I just really am over Henry VIII. One of which is the sheer amount of time that certainly English, I won't speak for other nations of the UK, history students have to spend studying Henry VIII and the Tudors, but specifically Henry VIII. So number one, we spend way too much time studying him given how important he was. And then, yeah, number two, he actually wasn't that important. And I don't know why everyone gasses him up so much. And there are so many period drama adaptations other than gossip and tea, because he had a Kardashian type lifestyle. So I'll get into two of them. I remember hours and hours during my school days having to study Henry VIII and the Tudors. You may also, Gary, if I say to you, divorced, beheaded, died, what would you say back?
Divorced, beheaded, survived.
There you go. So we've all memorized that. None of us know the second verse of the national anthem, but we all bloody know the order in which Henry dispatched with his 6 wives. So I double checked to see if there'd been a revolution in the national curriculum since I was at school some time ago. Guess what, Gary? Key stage 2, when you're aged 7 to 11, students typically study the Tudors as part of their unit on British history. This often includes key figures like Henry VIII and significant events like the Reformation. So 7 to 11, you're getting some Tudor. Key stage 3, ages 11 to 14. The Tudors are often revisited in more depth, covering themes like politics, religion, and society. This includes study of key events, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so 7 to 11, you've hit the Tudors, you've learned your rhyme. 11 to 14, you need to deep dive. You don't know enough about the Tudors. Let's go in more. But you're 14 now, you've been studying the Tudors for 7 years, so probably you're across it. No. Key stage 4, which is GCSE age, so you sit the exams at 16. History students in the UK often study the Tudors, including Henry VIII, as part of their curriculum. The specifics can vary on the examination board. So again, I'm not saying this is every student in every school, but many courses include topics such as the reign of Henry VIII, the English Reformation, and the broader Tudor period. This allows students to explore significant political, social, and religious changes during the 16th century. So at this point, you're 16, you sit down to sit your GCSEs, and you have been studying the Tudors and specifically Henry VIII for, let me do the maths in my head, we're talking like 9 years. And that's assuming you didn't do them prior to the age of 7 and you don't go on to do A-level history, which I did. So basically, I'm sorry, but like, if for us to be spending this amount of time on one monarch who lived hundreds of years ago, he really needs to be quite significant. Which takes me to my second point, which is I just don't think Henry's all that in terms of shit he achieved. He just had a messy personal life that we know a lot about because he was an oversharer and a sort of proto-Kardashian. So he had the 6 wives, sure. The only case I can think of you can make for Henry being important, and write in listeners if I'm wrong, is that he arguably began the Reformation. So for those of you who don't remember, Henry was married to his brother's wife, his dead brother's wife, Messy. And then he got the hots for Anne Boleyn, who he wanted to sleep with. And she was like, no sex before marriage. So he tried to get the Pope to annul his marriage. And then because of the geopolitical situation at the time, which we can go into another time, he couldn't get the Pope to annul it. So he broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, beginning the process of the English Reformation, i.e. the Church of England becoming Protestant. So that's kind of a big thing that happens. But Henry only does it because he wants to get his end away. And over the next few years, as various of his offspring become king and queens of England, we ping pong back and forth. So it's not even like he does the full Reformation. Henry bloody loves Catholicism by all accounts. He likes the bling. He likes the kind of like ceremony. He just liked the idea of being married to Anne Boleyn more. So Reformation, sure, maybe. There are arguably much more important Henrys. Henry V, who won the Battle of Agincourt, which gives England the claim to the French throne and, you know, arguably one of the origins of the English-French beef. Or his dad, Henry VII, who ended the War of the Roses and built the Tudor dynasty. Or, I would argue, some of his wives were kind of important. Anne Boleyn, arguably the person that began the process of the Reformation, and Catherine Parr survived, the last one, who was the one who was like, okay, squash the beef. You've been moving mad. You've been married to all these women. You've got these 3 kids, depending on like who's up or who's down. You've had, you know, Mary declared a bastard. Like, let's just make the family whole and agree that all of your children are legitimate and they are all in the line of succession. So that was Catherine Parr. She kind of paves the way for the Tudor dynasty. So yeah, basically, I'm well over Henry VIII. I think it's mental how much students in the UK study him, given all of the other things in our history. And yeah, I just think if we're talking about White History Month and stuff that's overplayed, it's got to be my man. It's got to be Henry. Do not like him.
So, he speaks very highly of you, is what I've heard.
Yeah, he's a sex pest.
So I have a couple of questions, really. The first is, could it be that it's because he's more interesting? Not as a person, but just
because of the shagging.
Well, he's messy. There's a reason why people watch the Kardashians, right? So if he is, compared to all of the other monarchs, is he a more engaging story? And my second question is how much of, not the curriculum, because that would have been set a while back, but how much of our current fascination with him is down to Hilary Mantel?
So I would argue, and sidebar, Hilary Mantel, who wrote an amazing trilogy of books, not about Henry VIII, but set in the time of Henry VIII, about Thomas Cromwell, very interesting historical figure. So I'm going to argue that it all predates Mantel and that Mantel is part of the cultural wave and obsession with the Tudors, because certainly she hadn't written any of her books when I was learning about Henry VIII relentlessly in school. And also, you know, the education reforms that Michael Gove brought in that was all about people should know about the kings and queens of England. So was Henry more interesting? I mean, anyone who's been married 6 times, like, yeah, there's some tea to spill. And he did kill 2 of his wives. So I'm not saying he was uninteresting. But if you just cast like even a little bit back, we had King Edward II, who was a gay king. Some say he was killed by red hot poker, being shoved where the sun apparently did not shine. I think that's been disputed. But like, you had a gay king who every one of his boyfriends would become a favorite and then like massively mess up the court because, you know, it was a patriarchal system. So if you were shagging a man and were like, you can be an earl, you can have all this land, then there'd be all this beef. So like loads of spicy stuff there. There was like Richard II, Richard III. There were a lot of wild people that were king of England. So sure, the marriage thing is interesting, but I'm not sure that like it's that interesting. And should history just be about salacious shaggers? I mean, I think no. And should white people just think of Henry? I think white people have other icons and heroes that they can know about. There is maybe something in like the era that they were alive in and the extent to which the written word and documentation and like the Holbein portraits of him. So maybe it's also about the time he was alive and the Renaissance and the extent to which we have lots of documentation and pictures and plays from the time. But I just think it's disproportionate. And, you know, yeah, as I say, there's if you sift through the old kings and a few queens of England and then later United Kingdom, it's quite a lot of gossip if you want to get into mess. I mean, where's the like sexy bonkbuster adaptation of King Edward II? Come on, we need to see that. Queer king, loads of beef. His wife was in the mix. It was really chaos.
Yeah, I didn't know all of that. I mean, it's also interesting with these things, right? That kind of, this isn't a name drop. She was a friend. Andrew Levy was a close friend. She used to say, or maybe it is a name drop, and she was a close friend, but she used to complain about how you tried to get something done on the Caribbean at the BBC, and they would say, oh, we did that last year. And she'll be like, yeah, but you've done 12 Churchills, you know. And so there's all the stuff that they're not teaching when they're teaching Henry VIII. Do you know what I mean? I don't think I did Windrush all the way through O-level school. I'm old, 55, but I'm not as old as Windrush. So it was history, but we didn't do it. We didn't really do slavery. We didn't do Southern segregation. We didn't do the civil rights movement, the independence movement. There's a bunch of stuff that I might have known. There's a bunch of rhymes maybe that I might have known about that were not even just relevant to kind of my personal history, but relevant to understanding where Britain was at that moment.
That's the thing that gets to me. Like, I only speak for Australians of my age group. You know, you talk to sort of Australian friends and you say, what did you study? And they're like, kind of just like Captain Cook on a loop. And like, yeah, Australians, no shade. Like, Australians, unless they're willing to delve into the genocide, they don't have a lot of history. It's a young country. I think the reason it feels so wild to me is it's this like selective memory that British people have where it's like 1066, William the Conqueror, ... Tudors, ... abolition of slavery, ... 2 world wars and 1 World Cup, and present day. And it's just like this sort of, well, let's cherry pick the bits that we want to choose. And yeah, so it's not that there's nothing of interest, but it's more that we are not Australia. We have like the 19th century alone, like the Industrial Revolution, the abolition of slavery, the construction of the railways, the franchise being extended to people who weren't just toffs, like loads of stuff happened in the intervening time between Henry VIII's 6 marriages and now, which feels quite important to understanding who we are. But so, yeah, for Henry, you know, it's less that I beef him. I'm more just like too much airtime. And I didn't know that I was, you know, setting myself up against the Tudor dynasty, but that's where I've ended up and I'm fine with it. Do you know what else, Gary? The number of adaptations. There's a new one with Jude Law coming out. I'm sure it will be, you know, ravishing. But as you say, how many, like what, we get like one Windrush thing, maybe one abolition thing. We rely on like brilliant filmmakers like Steve McQueen to like tell our stories. And then we're just getting another bloody Tudor adaptation. And we're writing history now, right? And in 20, 30 years, a lot of us will be living through how we've constituted these events as history and sort of how the stories get told, and that is important and powerful.
Yeah, so long as you have posh white guys writing history, then there's a very good chance that posh white people are going to come out as heroes. It's a West African proverb. Whenever I've tried to find out quite where in West Africa things fall apart, but that wasn't supposed to be an allusion to Chinua Achebe, but things do fall apart. But that only when lions get to write history will hunters cease to be the heroes. That necessity of reimagining who we are. And it's not just an academic exercise, I think. I think that, I'll give you an example. The French town of Toulon was the first major town more than city, first major town to vote Front National. The French town of Toulon was also, this was back in the late 90s, the French town of Toulon was also liberated by colonial troops, primarily Algerian and Moroccan troops. I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder if the people of Toulon would have the same understanding of people of Algerian descent, of Arabs, of foreigners, if they understood that those were the people who liberated them from the Nazis. Our histories inform the way that we think about the world. That's why I think Steve McQueen's film The Blitz is really important. The Second World War is like deep into British mythology, but the way that it's written, Black people don't appear in it. Even though it was around 1 million Africans who fought, all of the African Americans who thought, about 20,000 Caribbeans, both from British Caribbean and French Caribbean, were involved. How would we think of things like responsibilities, rights, immigration, Western values, all of that, if we understood that at Europe's hour of need, the threat to European values, Western values, came from within Europe, and black people came to save it from itself, even if they weren't accorded, as a result, the freedoms that other Europeans had. Knowing that stuff has an impact, I think, on how we think about ourselves now.
Yeah, I think there's even more than that. I completely agree. And I think there's something else, which is we get sold and told now about migration, globalization. And I don't want to pretend that like the 20th century is the same as the 21st, just in terms of how easy it has become to be connected to people in other countries. But we have, especially people in Britain, we have always been connected. As you say, like maybe the troops weren't turning up in the East End of London, but African and Caribbean troops were fighting in the Second World War. Like a lot of our wealth comes from extractive relationships with other countries in the world, and a lot of the wealth of many European countries. So it's like these connections and relationships aren't new. And sometimes they are presented as such when we're talking about, well, all of this migration and refugees and asylum seekers. But like we've all been kicking about on the same planet for quite a long time. And if we don't understand how and why, then yeah, we're going to have a lot of very ignorant conversations now.
And we are. Thanks for listening to Over the Top, Under the Radar. Remember to like, subscribe, leave a review wherever you get your podcasts.
You can also sign up to receive our newsletter at overunderpod.com.
And if you want to support the show, find us by searching Over the Top, Under the Radar on Patreon.
You can connect with us on social media. Gary and I are on Twitter/X, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and our handle is always the same at over_under_pod_.